In Gertie Farish's sitting room, whither a hansom had carried the two friends, Lily dropped into a chair with a faint sound of laughter. It struck her as humorous coincidence that her aunt's legacy should so nearly represent the amount of her debt to Trenor. The need of discharging that debt had reasserted itself with increased urgency since her return to America, and she spoke her first thought in saying to the anxiously hovering Gertie, "I wonder when the legacies will be paid." But Miss Farish could not pause over the legacies. She broke into a larger indignation. "Oh, Lily, it's unjust. It's cruel. Grace Stepney must feel she has no right at all to that money." "Anyone who knew how to please Aunt Julia has a right to her money," Miss Bart rejoined philosophically. "But she was devoted to you. She led everyone to think—" Gertie checked herself in evident embarrassment, and Miss Bart turned to her with a direct look. "Gertie, be honest. This will was only made 6 weeks ago. She had heard of my break with the Dorsets. Everyone heard, of course, that there had been some disagreement, some misunderstanding. Did she hear that Bertha turned me off the yacht? Lily! That was what happened, you know. She said I was trying to marry George Dorset. She did it to make him think she was jealous. Isn't that what she told Gwen Stepney?" "I don't know. I don't listen to such horrors." "I must listen to them. I know where I stand." She paused, and again sounded a faint note of derision. "Did you notice the women? They were afraid to snub me while they thought I was going to get the money. Afterwards they scuttled off as if I had the plague." Gertie remained silent, and she continued, "I stayed on to see what would happen. They took their cue from Grace Stepney and Lulu Melson. I saw them watching to see what Gwen would do. Gertie, I must know just what is being said of me." "I tell you, I don't listen. One hears such things without listening." She rose and laid her resolute hands on Miss Farish's shoulders. "Gertie, are the people going to cut me?" "Your friends, Lily. How can you think it?" "Who are one's friends at such time? Who but you, you poor trustful darling? And heaven knows what you suspect me of." She kissed Gertie with a whimsical murmur. "You'd never let it make any difference, but then you're fond of criminals, Gertie. How about the irreclaimable ones, though? For I'm absolutely impenitent, you know." She drew herself up to the full height of her slender majesty, towering like some dark angel of defiance above the troubled Gertie, who could only falter out, "Lily, Lily, how can you laugh about such things?" "So not as to weep, perhaps, but no, I'm not of tearful order. I discovered early that crying makes my nose red, and the knowledge has helped me through several painful episodes." She took a restless turn about the room, and then, reseating herself, lifted the bright mockery of her eyes to Gertie's anxious countenance. "I shouldn't have minded, you know, if I'd got the money." And at Miss Farish's protesting, "Oh," she repeated calmly, "not a straw, my dear, for, in the first place, they wouldn't have quite dared to ignore me, and if they had, it wouldn't have mattered, because I should have had been independent of them. But now—" The irony faded from her eyes, and she bent a clouded face upon her friend. "How can you talk so, Lily? Of course the money ought to have been yours, but after all that makes no difference. The important thing—" Gertie paused, and then continued firmly, "The important thing is that you should clear yourself. You should tell your friends the whole truth." "The whole truth?" Miss Bart laughed. "What is truth? Where a woman is concerned, it's the story that's easiest to believe. In this case, it's a great deal easier to believe Bertha Dorset's story than mine, because she has a big house and an opera box, and it's convenient to be on good terms with her." Miss Farish still fixed her with an anxious gaze. "But what is your story, Lily? I don't believe anyone knows it yet." "My story? I don't believe I know it myself. You see, I never thought of preparing a version in advance as Bertha did, and, if I had, I don't think I should take the trouble to use it now." But Gertie continued with a quiet reasonableness, "I don't want a version prepared in advance, but I want you to tell me exactly what happened from the beginning." "From the beginning?" Miss Bart gently mimicked her. "Dear Gertie, how little imagination you good people have. Why, the beginning was in my cradle, I suppose, in the way I was brought up, the things I was taught to care for. Or, no, I won't blame anyone for my faults. I'd say it was in my blood, that I got it from some wicked pleasure-loving ancestress, who reacted against the homely virtues of New Amsterdam and wanted to be back at the court of the Charleses. And as Miss Farish continued to press her with troubled eyes, she went on impatiently, "You asked me just now for the truth. Well, the truth about any girl is that once she's talked about, she's done for. And the more she explains her case, the worse it looks. My God, my good Gertie, you don't happen to have a cigarette about you?" In her stuffy room at the hotel to which she had gone on landing, Lily Bart that evening reviewed her situation. It was the last week in June, and none of her friends were in town. The few relatives who stayed on, or returned for the reading of Miss Penson's will, had taken flight again that afternoon to Newport or Long Island, and not one of them had made any proffer of hospitality to Lily. For the first time in her life, she found herself utterly alone, except for Gertie Farish. Even at the actual moment of her break with the Dorsets, she had not so keen a sense of its consequences, for the Duchess of Beltshire, hearing of the catastrophe from Lord Hubert, had instantly offered her protection, and under her sheltering wing Lily had made an almost triumphant progress to London. There she had been sorely tempted to linger on in a society which asked of her only to amuse and charm it, without inquiring too curiously how she had acquired her gift for doing so. But Selden, before they parted, had pressed on her the urgent need of returning at once to her aunt, and Lord Hubert, when he presently reappeared in London, abounded in the same counsel. Lily did not need to be told that the Duchess' championship was not the best road to social rehabilitation, and as she was besides aware that her noble defender might at any moment drop her in favor of a new protégé, she reluctantly decided to return to America. But she had not been 10 minutes on her native shore before she realized that she had delayed too long to regain it. The Dorsets, the Stepneys, the Bryes, all actors and witnesses in the miserable drama, had preceded her with their version of the case, and, even had she seen the least chance of gaining a hearing for her own, some obscure disdain and reluctance would have to restrain her. She knew it was not by explanations and countercharges that she could ever hope to recover her lost standing, but even had she felt the least trust in their efficacy, she would have still been held back by the feeling which had kept her from defending herself to Gertie Farish, a feeling that was half pride and half humiliation. For though she knew she had been ruthlessly sacrificed to Bertha Dorset's determination to win back her husband, and though her own relation to Dorset had been of the merest good fellowship, yet she had been perfectly aware from the outset that her part in the affair was, as Carrie Fisher brutally put it, to distract Dorset's attentions from his wife. That was what she was there for. It was the price she had chosen to pay for 3 months of luxury and freedom from care. Her habit of resolutely facing the facts, in her rare moments of introspection, did not allow her to put any false gloss on the situation. She had suffered for the very faithfulness with which she had carried out her part of the tacit compact, but the part was not a handsome one at best, and she saw it now in all the ugliness of failure. She saw, too, in the same uncompromising light, the train of consequences resulting from that failure, and these became clearer to her with every day of her weary lingering in town. She stayed on partly for the comfort of Gertie Farish's nearness, and partly for lack of knowing where to go. She understood well enough the nature of the task before her. She must set out to regain, little by little, the position she had lost, and the first steps in the tedious task was to find out, as soon as possible, on how many of her friends she could count. Her hopes were mainly centered on Mrs. Trenner, who had treasures of easy-going tolerance for those who were amusing or useful to her, and in the noisy rush of whose existence the still small voice of detraction was slow to make itself heard. But Judy, though she must have been apprised of Miss Bart's return, had not even recognized it by the formal note of condolence with which her friend's bereavement demanded. Any advance on Lily's side might have been perilous. There was nothing to do but to trust to the happy chance of an accidental meeting, and Lily knew that, even so late in the season, there was always a hope of running across her friend in the frequent passages through town. To this end, she assiduously showed herself at the restaurants they frequented, where, attended by the troubled Gertie, she lunched luxuriously, as she said, on her expectations. "My dear Gertie, you wouldn't have me let the head waiter see that I've got nothing left to live on but Aunt Julia's legacy. Think of Grace Stepney's satisfaction if she came in and found us lunching on cold mutton and tea. What sweets shall we have today, dear? Coupe Jacques or peaches à la Melba?" She dropped the menu abruptly, with the quick heightening of color, and Gertie, following her glance, was aware of the advance from an inner room of a party headed by Mrs. Trenor and Carrie Fisher. It was impossible for these ladies and their companions, among whom Lily had at once distinguished both Trenor and Rosedale, not to pass, in going out, the table at which the two girls were seated, and Gertie's sense of the fact betrayed itself in the helpless trepidation of her manner. Miss Bart, on the contrary, borne forward on the wave of her buoyant grace, and neither shrinking from her friends nor appearing to lie in wait for them, gave to the encounter the touch of naturalness which she could impart to the most strained situation. Such embarrassment as was shown on Miss Trenor's side, and manifested itself in the mingling of exaggerated warmth with imperceptible reservations, her loudly affirmed pleasure at seeing Miss Bart took the form of a nebulous generalization, which included neither inquiries as to her future nor the expression of a definite wish to see her again. Lily, well versed in the language of these omissions, knew that they were equally intelligible to the other members of the party. Even Rosedale, flushed as he was with the importance of keeping such company, at once took the temperature of Miss Trenor's cordiality, and reflected it in his offhand greeting of Miss Bart. Trenor, red and uncomfortable, had cut short his salutations on the pretext of a word to say to the head waiter, and the rest of the group soon melted away in Miss Trenor's wake. It was over in a moment. The waiter, menu in hand, still hung on the results of the choice between Coupe Jacques and peaches à la Melba. But Miss Bart, in the interval, had taken the measure of her fate. Where Judy Trenor led, all the world would follow, and Lily had the doomed sense of the castaway who had signaled in vain to fleeing sails. In a flash she remembered Mrs. Trenor's complaints of Carrie Fisher's rapacity, and saw that they denoted an unexpected acquaintance with her husband's private affairs. In the large tumultuous disorder of the life at Bellomont, where no one seemed to have time to observe anyone else, and private aims and personal interests were swept along unheeded in the rush of collective activities, Lily had fancied herself sheltered from inconvenient scrutiny. But if Judy knew when Miss Fisher borrowed money of her husband, was she likely to ignore the same transaction on Lily's part? If she was careless of his affections, she was plainly jealous of his pocket, and in that fact Lily read the explanation of a rebuff. The immediate result of these conclusions was the passionate resolve to pay back her debt to Trenor. That obligation discharged, she would have but $1,000 of Miss Penson's legacy left, and nothing to live on but her own small income, which was considerably less than Gertie Farish's wretched pittance, but this consideration gave way to the imperative claim of her wounded pride. She must be quits with the Trenors first. After that she would take thought for the future. Her ignorance of legal procrastinations, she had supposed that her legacy would be paid over within a few days of the reading of her aunt's will, and after an interval of anxious suspense, she wrote to inquire to the cause of the delay. There was another interval before Miss Penson's lawyer, who was also one of the executors, replied to the effect that, some questions having arisen relative to the interpretation of the will, he and his associates might not be in the position to pay the legacies till the close of the 12-month legally allotted for their settlement. Bewildered and indignant, Lily resolved to try the effect of a personal appeal, but she returned from her expedition with a sense of the powerlessness of beauty and charm against the unfeeling processes of the law. It seemed intolerable to live on for another year under the weight of her debt, and, in her extremity, she decided to turn to Miss Stepney, who still lingered in town, immersed in the delectable duty of going over her benefactress's effects. It was bitter enough for Lily to ask a favor of Grace Stepney, but the alternative was bitterer still, and one morning she presented herself at Mrs. Penson's, where Grace, for the facilitation of her pious task, had taken up a provisional abode. The strangeness of entering as a supplicant the house where she had so long commanded increased Lily's desire to shorten the ordeal, and when Miss Stepney entered the darkened drawing-room, rustling with the best quality of crepe, her visitor went straight to the point. Would she be willing to advance the amount of the expected legacy? Grace, in reply, wept and wondered at the request, bemoaning the inexorableness of the law, and was astonished that Lily had not realized the exact similarity of their positions. Did she think that only the payment of the legacies had been delayed? Why, Miss Stepney herself had not received a penny of her inheritance, and was paying rent, yes, actually, for the privilege of living in a house that belonged to her. She was sure it was not what the poor dear cousin Julia would have wished. She had told the executors so to their faces, but they were inaccessible to reason, and there was nothing to do but wait. Let Lily take example by her, and be patient. Let them both remember how beautifully patient cousin Julia had always been. Lily made a movement which showed her imperfect assimilation of this example. But you will have everything, Grace. It would be easy for you to borrow 10 times the amount I am asking for. Borrow? Easy for me to borrow? Grace Stepney rose up before her in sable wrath. Do you imagine for a moment that I would raise money on my expectations from cousin Julia, when I know so well her unspeakable horror of every transaction of the sort? Why, Lily, you must know that if you must know the truth, it was the idea of your being in debt that brought on her illness. You remember she had a slight attack before you sailed. Oh, I don't know the particulars, of course. I don't want to know them. But there was rumors about your affair that made her most unhappy. No one could be with her without seeing that. I can't help it if you are offended by my telling you this now. If I can do anything to make you realize the folly of your course, and how deeply she disapproved of it, I shall feel it is the truest way of making up to you for her loss. End of Chapter 4 of Book 2 of The House of Mrth.